Thanks very much. Two really interesting presentations coming at things from a very different perspective. So this session, we'll pose some key questions and then open up for a more of a general Q&A. So we've heard a lot about the importance of placemaking, obviously, in this morning's session. We've also explored ideas about the roles that we can play as local governments in shaping cities and indeed in creating wonderful places for people to live. There's a recent article that was written by Richard Florida about the premium of beauty and, the importance of that. And I think, Ethan, you talked about that as well in the context of, creating places and so on. So in terms of hardware, is there a hierarchy of hardware importance? And if so, could you share some examples of what good or bad sequencing, you've seen in terms of that hardware delivery? Rukshan, it's probably more of a question for you, really, in a planning context.
Sure. I think when we're talking about communities, every community is very different to each other. They have their own unique characters and identity and their unique goals for where they want communities to grow. So I don't think there's actually a specific list or a formula for the hardware that will achieve those outcomes. Because it's so different in every community. But that being said, I think it all starts with strategic planning. So if you set up that vision, the long-term vision for where you want the community to grow, and you've got the buy-in from the community and council for what that looks like, then once you have that in place, you have shared goals and shared outcomes. The next stage in that is developing a staging and infrastructure delivery plan. And the key here is really to analyze what is the critical infrastructure that the government needs to invest in that will stimulate private development and private investment, because at the end of the day, when you create these master plans, it's not like the whole thing is going to be developed by government. It really involves many stakeholders around the table between state government, local government, private sector, development industry, and then also nonprofit. Everyone has a role to play. So by identifying the key pieces of critical infrastructure that will actually stimulate that private investment, I think that's the key priority. Yeah.
I'll have a go at it too. Although I'm not technically a planner, but I do teach a bit of planning. And one of the things that really fascinates me about planning is the way that we do focus on this hierarchy of place. And the question that I have is there may be different planning that we do within the same system. So a city is not just made up of a hierarchy of places. A city is made up of different layers that come across that city. And so in terms of hierarchy, we might be talking about a retail strategy. And then, of course, there is a hierarchy of place that goes with that. And the infrastructure that is linked to those hierarchies of place, I think, are very relevant in transport, industrial, commercial, those sorts of things. But there's another element, which is the strategic side, which is what you were mentioning, and those ones, I'm not sure there's a hierarchy, because then we're setting up this idea that somehow we're competing. But it's almost like different places have their own little competitive advantage. So it's not, because it could be in a totally different industry. So there's no hierarchy per se in, for example, renewable energies or some advanced manufacturing thing in biotech, because those things will be in areas that are specifically advantage to them, which have nothing to do with Perth CBD. And I think we need to separate those two out when we're looking at planning, because if we put them together, then that's when outer metro loses out, because if we need to focus in on the strategic side rather than focusing on the hierarchy, which the state government's going to do anyway.
I think it's interesting also when you think about polycentric cities, and often in growth areas that's really what we're aspiring to, is to sort of have that opportunity where you're 20 minutes away from jobs and 20 minutes, being able to sort of access good amenity, good services and great places within your neighbourhoods. I think there's a real need in terms of the planning system for us to focus on what existing assets we have that we can better utilise, better grow, better support. And some of that I think is from an economic development perspective as well, understanding, where our little activity centres might already exist, where are those, points of interest that are already occurring in community and how we build and support those to establish. We certainly have an industry attraction focus, of course, as we need to in the outer growing suburbs, but I think sometimes what we already have, incrementally we can perhaps build on there as well and create that sense of place too.
Kelly, the one other thing I think that's important to this conversation is the idea of collaboration and coordination between government. So as an example, in Jinnabine, there's a school in town which is currently over capacity. I think there's 18 demountables, way too many students on that site. And through our master plan, we're looking at relocating the school to elsewhere in town. But the Department of Education, this comes back to the silos conversation that we were having earlier, Department of Education has committed to an upgrade of that school to get rid of the demountables, build some more permanent classrooms. Now, if they go ahead with that, then they'll invest tens of millions of dollars into a school upgrade for a school that might only be there for another 5 years, depending on the outcome of our master plan and whether we decide to relocate the school. So important when considering hardware and major infrastructure investments to really coordinate across government between the Department of Planning, Department of Education, every department, and also council to make sure that there's no duplication or anything like that.
I think that's an excellent point, and we talked earlier, in fact, in Ethan's presentation, he talked about public realm as being, an anchor tenant, and I think that's a really good example for some of the work that we've been doing in Wyndham. For instance, we've got our Werribee CBD catalyst sites, and we've chosen the most important site for these. These are PPP projects that we've been developing with some private partners, and the public realm piece is actually the bottom floor. It's the activation to the street, it's by the river. So I think, our ability to leverage and make decisions to influence and working alongside government and also developers, I think sometimes we underestimate our ability to do those things. But I really liked that concept of, the public realm is sort of the anchor tenant, and we really have to invest in that. And the other stuff will take care of itself naturally, because that's where people will want to be, and the market will then come in and sort of take over. But you've still got that heart, the community at the core of what we're doing.
A lot of the time, public spaces, on that note, public spaces get a lot of attention in parks. The town squares and the parks are the public spaces, but really, every street is a public space.
Exactly, yeah.
And if you think about how much space streets take, if you just looked at the whole of a whole map of a city, it's incredible the amount of public space that exists that isn't a park or a town square that needs attention for how they can be safe and accessible and inclusive. Streets I think they're often overlooked.
Great. One more question before we then go to a broader Q&A. I'm interested in exploring the role of technology in either developing hardware or being the hardware in and of itself. Have either of you got any views about that?
I think it's critical. I mean, we're in a technology era now, and we're in big data, artificial intelligence, and there's the role of technology in developing planning systems, but there's also understanding the response of planning systems to technology. So things like drones, things like even autonomous vehicles are all coming in. Like, that will be the next wave. So there's a big role for planning to understand the technology that's coming on board, but also and to embrace it, and then to use it, like big data, which is basically what we've. It's not. I wouldn't describe the planning platform that we have developed as big data, although some of it would be. But what it does is bring together research which allows a more comprehensive understanding of a planning of metropolitan area. And I think it's the first time it's been done in Australia, which is why it was awarded. We got $1 million through the federal government through the Smart Cities, Smart Suburbs with City of Wanneroo. And what's interesting about that project is it was only one of 2 councils in the whole of, I think, Australia, is that right? 2 out of metropolitan councils that were awarded, or in Perth maybe, that were awarded that money. So a lot of, if you look at the awarding of the money, a lot of it went to more inner or middle ring. So the fact that an outer metropolitan region was taking the lead in technology, because often we just follow, and so that's why I think it was the development of that platform, and our aim was to do it for Perth, but to actually show other councils all around Australia how you might be able to create better planning systems, more informed planning systems.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think on that point, it's also really important for us. The key question is, how we can use new technology to advance the livability and quality of life in our cities. And driverless cars get all the attention these days, but in many cases, there's technologies out there that will impact our cities that we don't even know exist yet. And that's probably most of the technology that will impact our cities. And I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Sidewalk Labs. It's a Google-affiliated company, and they're doing a pilot project in Toronto, Canada, called Quayside. And they're essentially applying these new technologies into an urban environment. So they're using urban data to control traffic lights and pedestrian crossings. The world's first entire neighborhood made completely of sustainably sourced timber, redesigning buildings to have weather shields so public spaces can be used in all weather conditions and all climates and all times of the year. All these types of technologies that can be used in an urban environment, and it's so much more than just the driverless car. And I think the challenge for us, being most of us in this room are government workers, whether it's state or local, is the contradiction between innovation and risk. So we all want to be more innovative, but being innovative means trying something new, and that means there's inherently some degree of risk associated with that, because you're trying something new, and then we all work for government, which is the most risk-averse climate that there is. So how can we kind of fuse the two together and really try to be innovative and overcome these risks? And it really comes down to us presenting. We're not decision makers in this room, or I guess some of us are actually. But it's how we can, as government workers, as public sector workers, how we can identify the risks and how we can mitigate those risks and present the case to the politicians who make the decisions, and with the benefit-cost ratios and considerations to make sure that we can introduce new technologies to improve our quality of life in our cities if we take the right risks.
Terrific. I think that's a great sum up, actually, of our session. Are there any questions before we wrap up there? No? Okay. Thanks very much. That was terrific. Thank you.
Thanks.